A Welcome to Gunnar the Viking, Viking historical fiction. Written by Bjorn Wolfe. Narrated by R.K. Marks. Copyright 2023 by BrooksAudiobooks.com and Shadowplay Communications, LLC. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without written permission from the publisher or author. Visit BrooksAudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.
Chapter 1. Sverrir and Hrafn. As the mariner sails along the shores of Hrafn in the Baltic, he spots several massive cairns and mounds resting upon a promontory. These structures, overlooking the sea and the surrounding landscape, mark the burial place of a powerful family of Vikings and rulers who dominated the island centuries ago, both before and after our era. Of all the cairns, the ones that catch the stranger's eye are those of Sverrir and his son Gunnar, the protagonist of our tale. I am here to recount the events that revolve around Sverrir and Gunnar and what transpired during their lives in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries. These events occurred around 1600 years ago, between AD 270 and 320. Sverrir earned his moniker, the wide-spreading, through his extensive and victorious maritime expeditions. He was one of the most prominent Vikings of his time, and his nautical prowess earned him both respect and fear. Despite their immense power, the Roman fleets could never muster the courage to attack him. He was a formidable fighter who waged war against various countries along their vast empire's coasts. Sverrir came from a lineage of great warriors and seafarers just like himself. They travelled from the Baltic to the Caspian Sea through the Gulf of Finland and westward along the coasts of Friesland, Gaul, and Britain to the Mediterranean's southern shores. Their ships were unique and greatly admired by the Romans. Even in the 1st century, the Romans were wary of these Nordic seafarers because of their impressive fleet sizes. They referred to them as Sueones, and they believed that these people lived on the northernmost shores of the ocean. What the Romans knew about their country came from what the Sueones themselves told them, as the Baltic Sea was entirely unfamiliar territory to the Romans. Sverrir was of high birth, traceable to Odin himself. He belonged to the Ynglingar sect of Odin's family which ruled over Fylkir, a kingdom that covered a large part of present-day Sweden. Sigurlin, the wife of the great ruler Sverrir, was undeniably beautiful and possessed all of the attributes expected of women in her high-ranking position. She was also of noble heritage, being a direct descendant of Skjold, one of Odin's sons and the progenitor of the Skjoldungar, the rulers of Hrafn, or what we know today as Denmark. Her father, Halfdan, was also a renowned ruler in the region and lived in the nearby town of Hlydra, not too far from present-day Copenhagen. However, Sigurlin and her husband resided in the grand settlement of Dampstadir. From this location, a breathtaking panorama of the land and coastline could be seen, stretching out beyond the horizon. Dampstadir was a sight to behold, with its many wooden structures of various styles and sizes, all intricately designed and beautifully crafted. Shingled roofs, heavily coated in tar, contrasted perfectly with the dark log walls, and the many buildings enclosed a vast quadrangle known as the Tun, or town. Looking out from the centre of the square, one would be struck by the picturesque and unique nature of each building, with no two looking the same. Towering lofts adorned with sleeping chambers and used for lookouts during times of war were interspersed with storehouses, porches, belfries, and piazzas, all weather-worn yet standing strong and firm. As the centuries passed, these magnificent structures remained standing, a testament to the enduring spirit and strength of the people who created them. In Sverrir's household, there were certain spaces reserved for the women of the family. These were their private areas known as skemmers, or bowers, where they would entertain friends and work on their sewing and embroidery. Meanwhile, there were also several communal halls meant for everyday use. During the winter months, long fires would run along the center of these halls, with smoke escaping through openings on the roof that could be sealed off when needed. Benches lined the walls, with tables set in front of them. Light entered through windows covered not with glass, but with the transparent membrane of a newborn calf stretched taut over the light holes. Sverrir's daily routine was quite simple. At the main daytime meal, his wife Sigurlin would sit on his left side, with the most high-born and wise men and women seated around them. The oldest and most experienced man present at the meal would sit in the northern high seat opposite Sverrir, with women on his right side and men on his left. It was customary for chiefs to bring the ale over the fire and offer a toast to the person in the high seat opposite them, and being toasted was considered a great honour. Of all the structures in the vast square, the greatest and most impressive was the banqueting hall. This was the building that the rulers and chiefs took the most pride in, as it was where they would entertain honoured guests and hold magnificent feasts. The banqueting hall at Sarier was one of the finest in the land of the Vikings, ranked 6th in terms of its beauty and grandeur. 2 magnificent doors at either end of the hall led inside, with solid oak jambs adorned with intricate carvings depicting religious scenes from the Viking culture. The depth of the carvings varied, creating a dramatic play of light and shadow that added to the hall's artistic effect. The grand entranceway boasted solid oak doors weighed down by the intricate beauty of flat iron bands. The elaborate designs etched into the doors and the hand-chiseled gems were divinely crafted, glistening in the light. 2 gold knockers, one for the men and one for the women, adorned each door with an air of grandeur. Once inside, the grand banquet hall was an unforgettable sight. The most skilled wood-carvers had chiselled their way to greatness, creating exquisite scenes of Sarier's ancestors and their grand expeditions. The carvings were so beautiful that no tapestry could even hope to match them. Adorning the walls, which had grown richly dark through the centuries, were shields of every shape and size. Each shield had a unique design and brilliant colours of gold and silver. The benches for the guests lined the walls running north and south, while in the middle sat the 2 high seats with arms on both sides and intricately carved pillars. The high seats faced each other, with the one in the northern position being the most important, as it faced the sun. This was reserved for the master of the house as the ultimate honour, with the opposite high seat set aside for the most impressive guests. The closer one sat to the high seat, the greater their honour, with the seats at the door being reserved for those of the least importance. Sarier's high seat was adorned with his weapons of choice, his single-edged sword, or sax, his double-edged sword, his shield, his brynja, or chain armour, and his golden helmet. But it was his magnificent double-edged sword named Hroti that truly stole the show. With a hilt and scabbard ornamented with gold and a blade crafted to perfection, no weapon could hope to outshine it. The sheathed sword, which was carefully wrapped with bands known as peace bands, could only be unlocked by Sarier himself. These bands held great significance as they were considered holy, and could only be undone when war was declared. Treasures from the Sarier's expeditions as well as those of his ancestors were scattered throughout the area. These items were highly cherished as heirlooms. Roman swords adorned the walls, inscribed with Latin phrases that had been in the family for over 200 years. The room was filled with Roman statuettes, bronze vessels, and other unique objects. A captivating collection of Roman coins, from the rule of Augustus through Sarier's time, was also on display. The most stunning pieces of art in the room were the exquisite Grecian cups, bowls, and drinking horns made of glass. Some featured charming paintings depicting rural scenes and wild beasts. Even men could be seen boxing with gloves, their colourful images reminiscent of when the paintings were first created. Down at the foot of Sarier, ships belonging to Sarier's fleet lay at anchor in the beautiful landlocked bay. Numerous sheds protected some of the ships from the elements, while carpenters worked busily in the nearby shipyards constructing and repairing vessels. The most impressive ships were the dragon ships, the largest and most formidable warships in existence. The prows and sterns of these ships were adorned with the heads and tails of one or more dragons. Some were covered with sheets of solid gold, reflecting brilliantly under the light of the sun. These ships could carry as many as 700 men. Other war vessels included the skeeds, snekjas, skutas, buzas, karfi, and ask. Provision ships also followed the fleets on their expeditions. The skeed was nearly as powerful as the dragon ships, but faster and able to carry up to 240 men. The snekja was a smaller version of the skeed. The skuta was the smallest vessel of them all, and could be maneuvered with ease. Ships of all shapes and sizes dotted the water, but the one that stood out was the ship designed for boarding. Its gunwale was strategically constructed to make it easier for warriors to leap aboard enemy vessels. All the ships, big and small, had only one mast, except for the old-fashioned kind described by Tacitus, which had no mast and relied solely on oars for propulsion. These boats were about 80 feet long, pointed at both ends like modern-day whaleboats, with a width of 10 or 11 feet at their widest point. They had 15 or 16 benches 3 feet apart, and were powered by 30 or 32 oars, each up to 12 feet long. 2, sometimes 3, men pulled each oar while a fellow with a shield that protected the oarsman on each outer side. The thole-pins were attached to the gunwales with sturdy bast ropes, and carved with graceful designs with each pair unique. The rudder was located on the side at the stern, resembling a large oar, and designed to be rowed in either direction. This maritime architecture was becoming outmoded in favor of sailing vessels. All the vessels were constructed from oak using the clinch-built method, where the planks overlapped each other and were fastened together with massive iron bolts. Sarier's domain, the island of Hrafn, had a dense population and was a major centre of trading due to its size and location. It was the equivalent of England in modern times, with a fleet of war and trading ships that sailed to distant lands for trade. The inhabitants were wealthy and traded with Rome, Greece, and countries surrounding the Caspian, Black and Mediterranean seas. They brought back remarkable bronze vessels, exquisite glass vases, velvets, silks, beautiful leather items, embroidered gold and silver fabrics for clothing, and other costly objects coveted by the wealthy, including wine. Chapter 2. The Viking Land and the Vikings. During the time that I recount, the land of the fierce Vikings spanned across the Baltic Islands and through the small and great belt leading out to the sea. Today, this territory is known as Scandinavia, enveloping the vast encompassing peninsula of Sweden and Norway, as well as the small Jutland Peninsula. This land was almost entirely surrounded by sea, with powerful fortresses erected on the southern Jutland Peninsula, nestled between two fjords coming in from opposite directions. This formidable defense guaranteed that no land invasions could occur from the south. The great islands were especially potent seats of maritime power and wealth. All tribes were of the same origin and lineage, sharing a common language, religion, and customs. They practiced the same burial rites, intermarried, and spoke the Norranian dialect. These Vikings were secluded from Central and Western Europe and created their own world, with the closest interaction being with present-day Russia. Towering swamps and wild forests, loaded with barbaric tribes, separated them from Rome. The Vikings differed greatly from their Germanic counterparts. These tribes identified themselves as Norsemen or Northmen. They were violent warriors and had been seafarers for ages. Today we only have a faint glimpse of the exploits undone on the sea during ancient times through graves that thousands of centuries have made venerable, or through significant tracings deeply carved on the rocks depicting sea battles, raids, and invasions. Like the hieroglyphs of Egypt, these inscriptions serve as reminders of a glorious past forever forgotten. The Norsemen solely used iron weapons, having abandoned the use of bronze weapons for centuries. Despite this, they were proud of their ancestral history, and boasted that their forefathers were the preeminent artisans of bronze weapons of their time, a claim that still holds weight to this day. Even before Sarier's age, the country could not sustain its growing population, leading its people to become more aggressive and hostile towards those inhabiting neighboring territories to the west. The Norsemen were a seafaring people, embarking on voyages to lands far and wide. Over the generations they traversed the waters of Friesland, Gaul, Britain, and other lands, seeking out new homes and riches. No sea was too treacherous, no distance too great for their fleets which swarmed over the waters, leaving no land unexplored. Year after year, an inexhaustible host of Vikings poured over Western Europe, their victories leaving no doubt that they were the masters of the sea. These expeditions were led by chiefs from all corners of their land, and the people eagerly flocked to join their ships, ready to wage war on the Romans. The Norsemen believed themselves to be the chosen people of the gods and the beloved of Odin. They never made any attempt to convert others to their beliefs. Like the Jews of old, they held themselves above all other religions. Once they had established a foothold in a new land, they imposed their iron rule with ruthless efficiency. Death held no fear for them, for they knew that Valhalla, the realm of Odin, awaited them. They also worshipped other gods and goddesses, including Frey, Njord, Thor, and Freya. The social structure of their land was built upon different grades of society. The Norsemen divided their country into herads, which formed separate realms. Some were more powerful than others, and with larger territories. Most of the estates within these realms were inherited by primogeniture or entail. At the head of each herad was a hreidar, the highest hereditary dignity in the land. The title of draught or high priest had faded into obscurity, replaced by that of hreidar. The concept of kingship was still unknown. Each herod had a head temple where yearly sacrifices were made for all the people. The Hreidar held the highest position in their community. He led during wars, administered justice, and functioned as high priest as well, caring for the temple, overseeing the sacrifices and other religious ceremonies. He held the farms and estates belonging to the temple in trust, receiving a temple tax from every man for its upkeep and for the sacrifices. He ruled over the general assembly of the Hreidar, known as the Thing, which was held several times a year. His power and affluence stemmed from his position, as he possessed vast amounts of land both at home and in lands conquered by his forefathers. He liberally bestowed expensive gifts and gold upon his warriors and bards. He instigated war, spilling blood upon the fields of battle, vanquishing his enemies to expand his wealth and property. Typically the wife of the Hreidar was of Odin's lineage, and their offspring were swathed in extravagant silk and linen. Their descendants ranked highest in the land. The sons were skilled horse-breakers, shield-benders, shaft-smoothers, ash-spear shakers, rowers and sailors. They were considered to ably scribe magical runes that protected the lives of men, blunting the edges of weapons and calming the seas with spells. They possessed the extraordinary ability to understand the language of birds, quench fires, read minds, and allay sorrows. Their strength and vigor were that of 8 men. Their locks were blonde, their cheeks rosy, and their eyes sharp as those of a young serpent. On the other hand, the Hreidar's daughters were delicately fingered, their hands and arms soft, their spirits lighter, and their necks whiter than fresh snow. They were charming and poised, possessing all the qualities befitting of a noblewoman. During the marriage ceremony, high-born female brides donned white bridal linen while walking beneath a bridal veil in accordance with custom. Directly under the Hreidar's rule were the Halds, the highest class of inhabitants in the land. They resided in ancestral estates that had been passed down for generations, collectively possessing immense power throughout the land. No Hreidar could govern without their consent. As the Halds' sons matured, they learned skills such as shield handling, elm bending, arrow shafting, spear throwing, horseback riding, hound setting, sword brandishing, swimming, runic writing, chess playing, wrestling, and various athletic games. Similar to the Hreidar's children, their daughters were attired in white garments when they wed, a wedding tradition among the highborn. After the Hald came a different group of landowners known as the Bondi, whose estates were also passed down through generations. These folks made a good living off of the land, breaking in oxen and crafting plows, building sturdy homes and barns and tilling the soil. Their daughters were always by their side, ready to lend a hand to their mothers, and when those daughters wed, they too wore pure the white garments of the Hersirs and Halds. They were permitted to start their own households and to slumber beneath linen sheets. They also shared in the fortunes of their husbands. Another class of free people rented the land, as they owned no plot of their own. Their doors were never locked, and they kept a fire burning in the hearth. A dense loaf of bread, homemade and substantial, rested on the table alongside a bowl of broth and a savoury joint of veal, which was considered the choicest of delicacies. A poorer class of freemen also lived in these parts. Just like the previous class of people, they too kept the doors of their homes always open. Both husband and wife were constantly preoccupied with their daily toil. The man's beard was neatly trimmed, his hair neatly parted down the centre, and his shirt hugged tight to his frame. His wife spun thread with a distaff, extending her arms to tend to the fabric. She wore a head covering to signify that she was no longer a maiden, and a kerchief around her neck, along with brooches to secure her dress fold onto her shoulders. And lastly, then there were the slaves, set distinctly apart from the rest in the starkness of their white woolen dress. They had close-cropped hair, in contrast to the freemen who wore their locks long. This was the badge of their bondage. These slaves hailed from foreign lands or were captured in war or purchased at a far-off marketplace, descendants of generations of subjugation. And yet they too managed to eke out a life's work from the land, although the telltale signs of their slavery were written deep in the creases of their skin, their crooked joints and thick fingers, their uncomely visages, their hunched backs, and their elongated heels. The husband lived a life doing things that he had to endure or bear. His work involved hard labor such as binding bark and thatch, hoisting heavy loads, and trudging the fields. In the evening, their wives would come home weary after toiling the whole day with calloused feet, sunburned arms, and bearing the scars of their own forms of bondage. As she entered the homestead, she would take a seat on the central bench, and son would join her. The married couple and their offspring lived contentedly, with the children taking on tasks like building fences, looking after hogs, tending to the goats, gathering firewood, or excavating peat as they grew older. These were the groups that constituted the inhabitants of the formidable and mighty Viking territory. Chapter 3. Sverrir consults the oracle. Sverrir was a man among men, with a heart that knew no fear. He began his life of battle at the tender age of 15, and many in the land believed he was foolish for his bravery. Others, however, saw the honor in his deeds and admired him greatly. Sverrir had earned his fame through his travels, fighting in 9 different lands and gaining a reputation that extended far beyond his homeland. As one of the great Hersirs, Sverrir had a band of 12 champions who served as his bodyguards. They hailed from all corners of the northern lands, from Norway to the Baltic Islands, and even from Fylkir. To serve Sverrir was a great honor, as he was known for his prowess in battle and his generous nature, always quick to reward his loyal companions with gold. All of Sverrir's champions were berserks. These men were fiercely competitive, each one striving to be recognized as the greatest among them. Achieving such an esteemed position was no mean feat, as all of the warriors in this land were both fearsome and reckless, skilled in the use of weapons and masters of athletic games. Once a champion had proven himself, the challenges would come pouring in, and these contests of strength and skill were often witnessed by large crowds of people. During times of peace, Sverrir's champions would travel the countryside, seeking out renowned warriors to face in battle. Berserks were a breed apart, rejecting chain armor and all forms of defense such as shields and helmets. Many of them even fought without clothing, their wild abandon and lack of caution often leading them to bite their own weapons, gnash their teeth, and wrestle with anything in sight. Their frenzied rage was unpredictable and could come upon them at any moment, causing them to lash out at their enemies with unparalleled ferocity. When berserks fought one another, the result was often deadly, and if the berserker fury took hold of them at home, they would flee in search of something to fight, wrangling with trees and rocks in their uncontrollable rage. Sverrir was a tough leader who had strict rules for his champions and warriors. He only accepted men who didn't fear death or show any signs of fear when in danger or after being wounded in battle. In fact, they couldn't even tend to their wounds until the next day. Sverrir also mandated that no man could carry a sword longer than 2 feet, yet the swords and saxes of his men were heavier than most, ensuring that their blows packed a heavy punch. Sverrir wasn't just strict, he was also an honorable leader. He made it a point to dock his ships before promontories, so that his fleet could be easily seen by all. The men on board didn't use tents to protect themselves from the weather, and never retracted their sails during storms. Despite this, Sverrir's men were some of the bravest in the land, and he never had more than 120 champions on his ship. He was a chivalrous leader who implored his warriors to be kind to others. His men couldn't break any man's spirit with fetters nor harm a man's wife. A woman was never taken without her father's consent, and without a dowry being paid, but Sverrir commanded that women and children should never be captured. With Sverrir as their leader, his warriors knew victory was almost guaranteed. However, not just anyone could follow Sverrir into battle. Only men between the ages of 18 and 50, with enough strength to lift a large nearby stone, were deemed fit. Sverrir's reputation was so great that even the best champions and berserks were eager to join his ranks for war. He had subjugated several chiefs on the southern shores of the Baltic, all of whom willingly paid him tribute. The leader wasn't greedy and used his power with moderation, but everyone under his rule had to accept his authority, including the humiliating tradition of him putting his foot on their neck as a sign of subjugation. In conclusion, Sverrir was a leader who demanded bravery and strength from his warriors, but he was also honorable and fair. His men were some of the bravest in the land, and his word was law. It's no wonder that he was respected by all those who knew him. Sverrir and Sigurlin had been married for many years, but no child had come to grace their home. So Hreidar of Hrafn decided to journey to Fylkir, the most powerful realm of the Viking lands, and Uppsalir, the holiest place in the north, to seek guidance from the gods and uncover the decrees of fate. Sverrir gathered a great fleet and bid farewell to Sigurlin, who accompanied him to his ship. They set sail directly for the fjord, and the wind was in their favor. On the second day, land came into view. Fortified towers and catapults stood on both sides of the narrow arm of the sea, guarding against any invasion from the water. Chains were laid across during war times, preventing ships from ascending suddenly. The moon shone brightly that night, and the fleet continued their voyage, urged on by a strong and favourable breeze. Eventually they came to the narrowest part of the fjord, which today is called Waxholm. The men shouted as they sailed past the fortifications, marvelling at the impregnability of Uppsalir. Despite this, the white peace shields fluttered at the mastheads, for peace had reigned between Hrafn and Fylkir for many years. As the fleet drew closer to Lake Malar, the wind grew weak, and the crews had to use their oars. 3 men were on each, their backs bending as they pulled hard against the water. They soon arrived at the head of the fjord, and through the several islands that dotted the river, where much of Stockholm stands now. Even that place was fortified with mighty catapults defending the channels between the islands. Then they entered the lake, a vast expanse of water 70 miles long, speckled with 1,400 islands. The banks were covered with magnificent forests of gigantic oaks. After a pleasant journey, they finally reached Uppsalir. Sverrir was welcomed with honour by Steinar, his kinsman, the ruler of Fylkir, and a descendant of Odin in the direct line. Great feasting and merrymaking followed during his stay. Many of the homes and buildings in Uppsala were said to have been constructed during the reign of Frey, Odin's successor. The temple itself was rumoured to have been built by Frey, and it was the most magnificent and revered building in all of Norseland. Gargoyles adorned its fantastic overlapping roof, looming over the sacred grounds and worshippers who came to make sacrifices. The temple was supported by structures made of pillars, and a gallery ran around the entire structure. Built of enormous red fir trees, its walls had weathered countless storms over many centuries. Inside, the walls, ceilings, and pillars were layered in red gold, including the altar on which the holy fire was always kept burning. During religious ceremonies, only the Hreidar of Fylkir was permitted to remain seated. All others had to stand until it was time for them to partake of the flesh of the sacrificed animals. The door to the temple had a rounded arch, masterfully carved to depict Odin offering a sacrifice. 2 stunningly crafted cats stood poised atop each of the pillars, while the door itself was adorned with delicate ironwork and a solid gold knocker. Not far from the entrance lay the holy spring where the bodies of men sacrificed to Odin were cast. The lands around the temple were considered sacred for many miles, and no other temple could compare to the grandeur of Uppsalir. Its yearly taxes and offerings, sacrificed for its maintenance, were the most substantial in the land, and large estates belonged to the temple. People from all over the Viking lands came to take part in the sacrifices, which were the most extensive in the north. On important occasions, chiefs would come from all over their realms to make sacrifices to the gods and learn the decrees of fate. It was during this time that Sverrir arrived and made a significant sacrifice. Black oxen and the finest horses had been specially fattened for the occasion. The walls of the temple were covered inside and out with the blood of the sacrificed animals, and the herseers, along with the spectators, were also sprinkled with the blood. The gods were called upon, and holy chips dipped in the blood of the sacrifices were thrown into the air. It was said that Sigrlinn would give birth to a son in about a year, and with great joy in his heart, Sverrir set sail for Dampstadir to share the news with his wife. Upon his return from abroad, he remained at his estate, eagerly anticipating the prophesied event that had been foretold through the casting of sacrificial chips. In the meantime, he devoted himself to observing the vast expanse of his land, meticulously overseeing the construction of a grand fleet of ships, and personally supervising the labourers to ensure their toil was not in vain. He took great pride in his prowess as a farmer, and often engaged in activities of the field. To occupy himself in leisurely moments, he made a variety of finely crafted, damascened swords. He also focused his attention on the seas, keenly observing the fisheries and seal-catching practices, as these were valuable opportunities for training future sailors. Whenever he wanted to entertain himself further, he engaged in a spirited game of chess on a board whose squares were fashioned from precious metals, or indulged in the thrill of the hunt with his highly skilled hawks. Chapter 4. Gunnar's Birth and Life Forecast. Around the year 275, 14 months following Sverrir's return from Uppsalir, a momentous occasion occurred at Dampstadir that brought immense joy to Sverrir and Sigrlinn. The gods had accepted Sverrir's sacrifice in Uppsalir to end his wife's infertility, and Sigrlinn gave birth to a son. At the time of the birth, Sverrir was hosting some of his relatives in the grand banqueting hall, where they listened to a poet recount the heroic accomplishments of their forebears. Messengers were dispatched to inform Sverrir of his good fortune. Present for the birth were Oddrun, Sverrir's married sister, other high-born women, individuals living in or near damp Sarier, and female servants. The law of the land mandated that women had to bear witness to a child's birth, and none of those present could leave until they had seen the infant in the arms of their mother. True to custom, the newborn was set on the ground and awaited the arrival of his father. Once Sarier arrived in the room, his newborn child was placed in his arms, and he covered him with the folds of one of the corners of his cloak. This act signified his recognition of the child's legitimacy. Sarier studied his baby intently, examining his features, proportions, luck, and temperament. After carefully assessing the infant and determining that he was well-formed, Sarier resolved that the child should live and not be abandoned. This practice mirrored that of the Spartans, where a father served as the sole arbitrator regarding whether a newborn lived or died. Afterward, the most significant and sacred of ceremonies, name-fastening, took place. This ancient baptismal ritual, which involves the pouring or sprinkling of water on the child, has endured even to this day. A vessel brimming with water was brought forth, and Sarier, with a voice enunciating to all present, poured the water over the child. "Let his name be Gunnar, in honor of his grandfather," he declared. "He shall be of Odin's kin, distinguished among men. He will fight bravely in many battles, like his mother before him, and his father's son shall he be called, for he shall begin his war campaigns at a young age and traverse faraway lands." With the conclusion of this ritualistic ceremony, the life of Gunnar became holy, like that of all men. No longer did his father hold the authority to abandon him or take his life, for that would constitute homicide. As a signifier of the child's name, Sarier first bestowed upon him a fresh sprig of garlic, to symbolize that just as the herb towered above the other plants, so would little Gunnar rank highly among society. Then, in immediate proximity to him, the precocious infant was gifted a two-edged sword, a sax, chainmail, shield, and silver helmet. These items were specifically manufactured with the assumption that the newborn would be male, and so it is commonly said that nobly born babies are born with weaponry. Also conferred to him were 2 large plots of land, Ringstadir and Heiton, and every livestock born on the various farms of Sarier on the day of Gunnar's birth were to be his, along with their offspring, a traditional protocol. According to Svarier's champions and warriors, destiny held only good tidings for them. Little Gunnar, like his father and forefathers, would eventually become a powerful fighter, emboldened by his innate, serpent-like gaze reminiscent of the Inglingars. Night descended, enveloping the residence where young Gunnar and his mother slumbered in silence. Complete darkness blanketed the area, and nobody uttered a single word. This was because it was believed that the 3 Nornir Urd, symbolizing the past, Verdandi the present, and Skuld the future, would come that very night to preordain and shape the life of Gunnar. These 3 beings were believed to dictate the fate of every human at the time of their birth, and their edicts were unalterable even by divinity. They etched signs on wooden shingles regarding the laws of human beings. In Norse mythology, there existed a powerful trio known as the Nornir. These 3 beings were believed to guide the course of humanity with their wisdom and insights, shaping the past, present, and future. Urd was one of the Nornir, and she was considered the most majestic and wise of them all. Her long hair was as white as snow, and she exuded an aura of calm and serenity. Urd's gaze was fixed on the distant past as she remembered everything that had happened since the dawn of time. She was content with the knowledge that change was constant, and that every moment was an opportunity for transformation. Verdandi was the second Norn, and she was dazzlingly beautiful. Her golden chestnut hair shone in the light of the sun, and her face reflected the many joys and wonders of the world. She watched over the present, knowing that it was inextricably linked to the past that Urd represented. Although Verdandi felt saddened by the sorrows and woes that men inflicted upon themselves, she also knew that the Nornir could not be blamed for such things. Skuld, the 3rd Norn, was the embodiment of immortality. Butterflies surrounded her, and her garment shone like a silvery cloud. She held the thread of life for every human being, and her hair sparkled with rays of light that were brighter than the sun. Skuld's vision was focused on the future, and she took immense pleasure in imagining all the possibilities that lay ahead. She offered hope to every person in the world, knowing that the Nornir had the power to shape their destinies. However, Skuld also recognized that life was fleeting, that every person had a limited amount of time to fulfill their purpose. With one hand, she held the thread of life, ready to cut it when their time was up. The Nornir, 3 powerful beings were the seers of fate who dwelled within the grand hall beneath the mighty ash tree named Yggdrasil. In this locale, the gods tended to their affairs, imparting their judgments and decisions. The ash tree towered above, colossal and evergreen. Its branches stretched out over the expanse of the world and into the heavens. The tree's existence was upheld by its 3 roots, which stretched far and wide. One of these roots housed a well, where all the knowledge and intellect of the world were hidden. As night approached and the world fell into sleep, a profound silence settled upon the grand hall. It was at this moment the Nornir, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld arrived, following the ancient beliefs of the Norse people. Their purpose was to divine the fate of young Gunnar. The 3 seers declared to him that he must strive to become a valiant and wise chief, and ultimately a just ruler of his people. The Nornir unraveled the threads of fate which they held tightly in their hands and meticulously fastened them in the heavens. They hid one thread in the east and another in the west, predicting that Gunnar would hold land between them. However, Skuld, with an ominous tone, flung a thread that wound across northern roads. They declared that this thread would hold firm and lead to Gunnar never conquering any land north of Hrafn. This fateful proclamation destroyed the dream that he had held for so long to extend his dominions northwards. To further empower him, the Nornir bade Gunnar to learn and understand the language of birds. As their words echoed through the hall, the 3 seers departed from this place, ready to divine the fate of many other lives yet to come into the world. Chapter 5. The Fostering of Gunnar. Gunnar flourished splendidly, to the elation of his doting parents who brimmed with joy when his tiny tooth first broke through his gums. His father, in the steadfast tradition, bestowed upon him a tooth fee as a gift. It came in the form of a knife, ensconced in a golden sheath that hung from a regal leather belt and was sewn and embellished with golden thread. A breathtaking buckle of solid gold topped it all off, and to sweeten the deal, Gunnar's father gifted him a vast farm in close proximity to Dampstadir. The land would be his home upon reaching adulthood. As time lumbered on, Gunnar grew into an exquisite child, boasting fair features and bright blue eyes reminiscent of his kin. Like any child his age, he revelled in play, and nothing delighted him more than to set a toy boat in water, whimsically watching it sail off to sea. When young Gunnar hit the age of 6, his parents started thinking about sending him off to be fostered. Customarily, young boys of reputable and accomplished men were not reared at home for fear of them becoming effeminate. Instead, they were dispatched to a renowned friend who was known for their bravery, tact, wisdom, and accomplishments. This way, the fostered child could obtain a comprehensive education befitting their standing in society. Sverrir and Sigurlin were mired with apprehension about their son's education. They yearned for him to be the wisest and most accomplished of warriors. They loved their son boundlessly, however. It took great fortitude for both of them to be willing to part from Gunnar for a considerable amount of time. They felt it was their greatest duty to ensure their son's prosperity. They fixated on an esteemed man by the name of Gudbrand to become Gunnar's Raudasandur father. Gudbrand was a Hreidar who no longer set out on expeditions. He presided over the island of Engel, which is still called by the same name to this day. The island is situated in the Kattegat, near the striking promontory of Kullen and the present shoreline of southern Sweden. Sverrir and Sigurlin greatly admired Gudbrand and held him in the highest regard. They deeply treasured their friendship with him. They couldn't think of a better man to teach their son all of the skills necessary for high-born individuals during those times. Gudbrand and Sverrir, who were Raudasandur brothers, were seasoned warriors who had fought together on many expeditions. They had left a trail of fallen Roman, Gallic, and British foes in their wake, wielding their axes and swords with deadly efficiency. Despite the perils they had faced and the wounds they had sustained, the bond between them was unbreakable. Although Gudbrand wasn't as wealthy or influential as his brother, he had a significant bloodline, with ties to the chiefdoms that ruled over the vast peninsula of Sweden and Norway. He could also trace his lineage back to Odin himself, a point of pride for him. Deciding that they wanted Gudbrand to foster Gunnar, Sverrir and his wife Sigurlin sent messengers to invite him for a visit, keeping their true intentions a secret. The messengers were all set to depart when an immense fleet of 15 ships suddenly appeared on the horizon, putting a halt to their plans. The ships were flying white peace shields, indicating that they weren't hostile, but it was still unclear who they were or what they wanted. As they drew closer, the colors of the ships' shields and sails became more distinct and dazzling, especially the yellow, red, and black hues. The lead vessel was a dragon ship, complete with a gleaming gold-embroidered standard depicting an eagle in its center. Gudbrand's ship was unmistakable, and his arrival promised to add an intriguing new dimension to the unfolding saga. From the highest tower, Sverrir and Sigurlin watched as Gudbrand's ship approached the shore. They had been eagerly awaiting his arrival, and their hearts swelled with joy at the sight of him. They knew, deep down, that it was a good omen for the future of their son. Sverrir wasted no time in making his way down to the shore to greet his Raudasandur brother as soon as his ship cast anchor. Gudbrand was received with great honor and hearty demonstrations of joy. It had been 2 long years since they had last seen each other, and the reunion was a momentous occasion. In the great hall, Gudbrand was seated on the high seat opposite Sverrir. All the steersmen of Gudbrand's ships and his champions were present, each one taking their place according to rank. The feast was a grand affair, with ale and mead served in silver and golden horns. Merriment filled the halls until the early hours of the morning, after which they all retired to their separate houses. Gudbrand was given the finest residence, fitting for a high-born guest. The following day, as Gudbrand was chatting with Sverrir's champions in the banqueting hall, he was suddenly interrupted by Sverrir's entrance with little Gunnar in his arms. Before Gudbrand knew it, Sverrir had placed the child on his knees. The ancient custom of knee-seating meant that Gudbrand was now bound to become Gunnar's foster father until he came of age. There was a loud cheer of approval from Sverrir's champions. Gudbrand was famed for his wisdom, athletic prowess, and many other accomplishments. It was a wise choice indeed for a foster father. By knee-seating Gunnar, Sverrir had shown the greatest proof of his friendship, esteem, and regard for Gudbrand. It was a deeply meaningful gesture, one that would not be forgotten any time soon. Gudbrand made a promise to his fellow warrior and Raudasandur brother that he would raise young Gunnar to the best of his ability. Then, with a pensive tone, he reminded Sverrir of an ancient saying that cautioned against trusting an early-sown field or a son too soon. Nature and experience are unpredictable, and both could lead to disappointment. Gudbrand also acknowledged the capricious power of the Nornir, which weaves a diverse array of fates for humanity. Some receive good fortune, others sorrow, and still others mediocrity. The Nornir's decrees may seem unfair, but they cannot be reasoned with or avoided. The poet especially is likely to face ambiguous rewards, but at least his name will endure forever, his memory preserved like that of a great hero. Gudbrand's stay in Dampstadir was marked by lavish feasting and drinking, a customary way to show hospitality in those days. The chiefs saw stinginess as a grave flaw, and so they were most generous with their guests. Many evenings were spent listening to poets and skalds who sang of the great feats of war accomplished by Sverrir's and Gudbrand's ancestors, as well as those accomplished by the 2 Hersirs themselves. Ulf, a renowned poet who only spoke and answered questions in verse, was among Gudbrand's champions. Although powerful chieftains offered him great pay to join them, he remained with Gudbrand because he loved him deeply, and he found Engel, the land of Gudbrand, to be the most beautiful place he had ever seen. One night, when all the other champions had retired, Sverrir remained alone with Ulf. Ulf then composed a magnificent song on the deeds of Sverrir's father, which took most of the night to recite. Sverrir thanked him, and the following day spoke to his treasurer about how he should reward the skald for his wonderful gift. Sverrir suggested giving Ulf 2 trading ships, but the treasurer thought it was too much. Sverrir reasoned that the ruler of Hrafn was wealthier than many Hersirs, and stated that other chiefs give costly things like good swords or gold bracelets as rewards for a song made for them. Sverrir ultimately decided to present Ulf with a fine trading ship, a new scarlet cloak, a gold-ornamented sword, and a heavy bracelet of gold. He also invited him to come and stay a whole year with him. Ulf expressed his gratitude and revealed that he would come in 2 years, after visiting his kinsman in Britain. After staying for over 3 weeks, Gudbrand talked about returning to Engel. Sigurlin attempted to persuade him to stay longer, and ultimately convinced him to stay for an extra week. She had been sewing and making garments for Gunnar, but they were not ready, not yet. The day of Gudbrand's departure drew closer, and Sigurlin was heartbroken at the thought of parting with her beloved little son. On the eve of Gunnar's departure, Sigurlin did not sleep. She held her son tightly in her arms, often pressing him so tightly against her heart that she woke him a few times. It was not a separation of a day from her child, but one that would last for many years. Sigurlin's heart was deeply grieved. When Sigurlin awoke in the morning, her once rosy cheeks had lost their hue. The rising sun was a dreaded sight, signalling that the hour of departure was creeping closer. But Sigrun was proud and hid her sorrow and anxiety well, except for her notable pallor. After breakfast, preparations for Gudbrand's departure began in earnest. Men said goodbye to their friends, drinks were shared, and gifts were exchanged. Sverrir bestowed costly presents of gold to Gudbrand and his warriors. Eventually all the men and ships departed, leaving only Gudbrand's vessel near the shore. With the sun showing it was noon, Sigrun had to muster her courage to appear cheerful despite her inner anguish. The horns for departure blared as the ships set sail, with the household and slaves accompanying Gudbrand and his son to the shore. The little boy cheerily chatted with his parents as they walked him to the gangway, and after many goodbyes and expressions of love and friendship, they parted ways. Sigrun watched until the ships vanished on the horizon, then made her way back to her bower. Once alone, she wept for the loss of her loved ones. Gudbrand's fleet had a smooth sail for 3 days until they arrived at Hrafnista, his burg and residence on Engel. Sigrid, Gudbrand's wife, was ecstatic to see her husband and their son. It was no surprise, as little Gunnar was a dear and handsome boy. As time passed by, the love between Gunnar and his Raudasandur family flourished. Growing older, he became stronger and increasingly manly, each year excelling both in mind and body. Gunnar and his Raudasandur brother Ingun, Gudbrand's son, were taught how to write runic characters and decode mystic runes. This equipped them with the ability to convey secret messages to their intended receivers, a skill reserved only for high-born men. Both boys learned how to carve runic letters with precision upon wood, stone, and even on jewels of gold and silver, and inlay mystical characters on weapon blades. The North attributed the art of writing to Odin himself. Among the European civilizations of that time, only the Romans, Greeks, and Norsemen possessed the ability to read and write. Gunnar and Ingun became exceptional athletes as they grew up, surpassing their peers in skill and dexterity. Their armor-clad bodies were said to swim like seals, with their weapons and gear safely nestled on their backs. They were adept at using either hand when throwing spears, and handling swords, axes, and shields. The same could be said about striking and shooting, which they did with ferocity, whichever hand they used. The speed with which they could move a sword or sax was so fast that it couldn't be seen with the naked eye. The split-second movement can only be sensed by the hissing sound it made. The brothers also had an unerring eye with a bow and arrow, hitting checkers on men's heads without causing injury. And woe to the person for whom their stone is intended, as they could sling it with fatal accuracy. Gunnar boasted an impressive ability to leap forward and backward with remarkable dexterity, even surpassing his Raudasandur brother, and no young man his age could beat him in any of the athletic games. The Raudasandur brothers were raised to be warriors of the sea. Their training went beyond just the physical aspect. They were taught foreign languages, essential for trade and war. Vikings needed to be able to communicate with the peoples they encountered on their expeditions. They were also instructed only in the basics of poetry, for it was a gift of the gods that could not be taught. One had to be born a true skald, and only the rules and meters of poetry could be passed down to them. Chess was also a popular game among the Norsemen, and the brothers spent countless hours mastering it. However, it was Gudbrand who instilled in them the love of fame and adventure. He regaled them with stories of his own expeditions, and sang to them the songs of the old warriors who had gone to Valhalla. It was his desire that both Gunnar and his brother would emulate the great examples of their predecessors. As Gunnar grew older, his curiosity about the world deepened. One day he approached Gudbrand with a sudden urge to learn about the beginning of all things. Gudbrand, a devout follower of Odin, shared with him the story of creation that had been passed down from previous generations. Before the creation, there was nothing but a void called Ginnungagap. On either side of this void were 2 worlds, Niflheim, or the world of cold, and Muspelheim, which was the world of heat. The northern side of the void was filled with ice and rime, while the southern side was warm and shining. Over time, the rime melted into drops as it met the heat from Muspelheim. The brothers' training in naval exercises and their education in other areas of Viking life prepared them for the adventures that lay ahead. They would go on to lead their expeditions and write their own stories of valor and conquest, all thanks to the teachings of their wise and loving mentor, Gudbrand.